May I offer to yourself and General Marshall my best thanks for the most interesting and instructive day which you have permitted me to spend with your troops. My only regret is that the time at my disposal did not allow a longer visit. I've had considerable experience of such inspections, and I can say that I have never been more impressed than I was with the bearing of the men whom I saw. The undemonstrative, therefore grim determination which was everywhere manifest, not only in the seasoned troops, but in the newly drafted, bodes ill for our enemies. That letter was written on the morning of June 25th, 1942. The man who wrote it was Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was 67 years old. He had been at war for nearly 3 years. The day before, he had been standing on a parade ground in South Carolina, watching American soldiers train in the summer heat. 9,600 of them moving in columns across red clay under a sky that offered no relief. At some point during that afternoon, Churchill turned quietly to the man beside him, General Sir Hastings Ismay, his own Chief of Staff, and asked what he thought. Ismay's reply: "To put these troops against German troops would be murder." The letter to Stimson exists in the State Department archives. Ismay's verdict is preserved in the accounts of historians. Both were given by men who had watched the same soldiers on the same afternoon in June 1942. This is a story about the gap between them, what filled it, what it cost, and which of the two men turned out to be right. Understanding why that gap existed means going back 2 years to what Churchill was, and what he needed, long before he stepped off a presidential train in South Carolina wearing a Panama hat. In May 1940, Winston Churchill was 65 years old and had spent most of the previous decade in political exile. He had warned against Hitler. He had been ignored. The men who ignored him had run out of options, and so, in the small hours of May 10th, as German columns poured into Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, the Conservative Party gave him what it had refused him for 30 years. By the time Churchill reached Downing Street, France was already dying. It would last 6 weeks. Britain would stand alone. 2 years of fighting a war that could not be won on the resources available to fight it. That is what followed. The Battle of Britain bought time in the air, but the war at sea was bleeding the country dry. And by the beginning of 1941, Britain faced bankruptcy. Not metaphorical bankruptcy, actual insolvency, the point at which the cash to buy American munitions and food simply ran out. Churchill had to plead. It was not in his nature, and he had no choice. In February of 1941, he went on the radio and directed a speech across the Atlantic to Franklin Roosevelt. He closed it with a line that would become famous: "Give us the tools and we will finish the job." In private, he said something rather different. Churchill told his private secretary that the Americans' love of doing good business might lead them to strip Britain of every realizable resource before showing any inclination to be the Good Samaritan. He was not wrong. He said it anyway. And a particular discipline is required to publicly celebrate the goodwill of a country one privately believes is abandoning the alliance. Churchill maintained it for 2 years. He had no alternative. Britain's survival was not a diplomatic consideration. It was the literal condition for everything else. Every word of public confidence in American power, every toast at every dinner, every cable drafted with careful warmth, all of it was in service of one objective: keep America moving toward the war. Keep the tools coming. Do not say, under any circumstances, what you actually think. Then, on the night of December the 7th, 1941, the phone rang. Roosevelt told him the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Churchill's reaction, preserved in his own memoir, written in his own hand, was not grief, and it was not rage. It was relief. And after more than 2 years of solitary struggle, he went to bed. He would later write that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. But the relief lasted exactly as long as it took to recognize the new problem. America was in the war. But which war? The Pacific burned. The anger was directed at Japan. Churchill was on a ship to Washington within 7 days. He arrived on December 22nd. The Arcadia Conference, 3 weeks of strategy debates between the British and American military staffs, began almost immediately, and the arguments were immediate and serious. Admiral King wanted the Pacific. General Marshall wanted a cross-channel invasion of Europe in 1942. Churchill wanted North Africa. What he needed, above all, was the decision that history records as Germany first, the agreement that defeating Hitler takes priority over the Pacific campaign. He got it. It was his essential victory of those 3 weeks, and he knew it. There were lighter moments inside the formality. One morning, Roosevelt went looking for Churchill and found him emerging from the bath, freshly scrubbed, pink, and wholly unclothed. Churchill looked at the President of the United States and said, without missing a beat, that the Prime Minister of Great Britain had nothing to conceal. The story traveled. The relationship it described, improbable, complicated, and genuinely warm, was the political spine around which the entire war would be organized. On December 26th, 5 days before the year ended, Churchill stood before a joint session of Congress. The chamber was still in shock from Pearl Harbor. Churchill gave them something to believe in. He mocked Japan's calculation. What kind of a people do they think we are? He spoke of American industry converting to war purpose at a rate the dictator states could not foresee. He said that orders being given that very day will produce results in war power beyond anything which has been seen or foreseen. He closed with defiance and received a standing ovation. He had told the King of England that the Americans were all talk and did nothing. He told Congress they were already winning. The gap between those two statements is where Churchill lived. What he could not say publicly in December 1941 was what everyone with access to the numbers already knew. The American army was not ready, and the officers at company level had no combat experience. The training relied on methods designed for an army that had not yet fought anyone. America had the industrial capacity to win the war. It did not yet have soldiers who could. The British Chiefs of Staff knew it. Churchill knew it. Nobody said it at the podium. Between that speech and the second visit to Washington 6 months later, the world did not improve. It deteriorated systematically, as though working through a list. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941, the same day Churchill had addressed a country still celebrating. Singapore fell in February 1942, the worst British military defeat in 2 centuries. Rangoon fell in March. India appeared genuinely threatened. The Germans pressed toward Stalingrad. And in North Africa, a German general named Erwin Rommel, who operated on supply lines that should have strangled him months ago, continued advancing. Each disaster arrived before the previous one had been absorbed. The pattern was not random bad luck. It was the shape of what happens when the resources available cannot match the commitments made. Churchill weathered it politically. He would later observe that anyone hoping to defeat him in Parliament would be lucky to round up 20 votes. But weathering it politically was not the same as having options. By June 1942, Churchill's options were narrowing. The disasters were compounding, and the American military machine whose existence he had been publicly celebrating was still, in the private assessment of his own staff, not ready to fight. He flew to Washington on June 21st. The meeting with Roosevelt was already arranged. The agenda was the invasion of North Africa. Then the message arrived. Churchill was in the Oval Office. Roosevelt was handed a pink slip of paper. He read it and passed it across without a word. 33,000 British and Commonwealth troops had surrendered at Tobruk. A German force half their size accepted the capitulation. The port, the supplies, the garrison, gone. Churchill absorbed this in silence. He was sitting inside the evidence of American power, surrounded by American generals, receiving the worst news of the North African campaign. There was no way to manage it. It simply arrived. Roosevelt looked at him and said, "How can we help?" Not a word of recrimination, not a question about what went wrong. 4 words, quietly delivered, and Churchill had his answer. The answer, organized largely by General George Marshall, was Fort Jackson. Don't argue strategy. Marshall's logic ran. Don't produce numbers or projections. Take him to South Carolina and let him see it for himself. Fort Jackson was an infantry training base then supporting the formation of 9 divisions, 9,600 soldiers, columns of armor and artillery, and the 1st Battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry from Fort Bragg, waiting to jump. On the evening of June 23rd, Churchill, Ismay, Stimson, Marshall, and their staffs boarded the presidential train south. The country they were traveling through had been at war for exactly 6 months. The soldiers they were about to watch had never fought anyone. The train arrived at Fort Jackson at 11 o'clock the following morning. Churchill stepped off the carriage directly onto the parade ground. He was wearing a Panama hat. The heat was already stifling. South Carolina in late June does not negotiate, and the air had the thick, close quality of a place where shade is a theory. Churchill described stepping out straight onto the parade ground, which recalled the plains of India in the hot weather. He knew what hot parade grounds looked like. He had inspected soldiers on 3 continents across half a century. He was 67 years old, compact and heavy through the chest, squinting against the Carolina sun beneath the wide brim of a hat that belongs at a garden party. 9,600 men were in review. Infantry, then tanks, then artillery. Moving in columns, the drums of their boots on the red clay carrying across the open ground. The ground shook. Churchill watched. He nodded. He said nothing that gets written down. Then the paratroopers. The 503rd was waiting near the airfield. Their equipment, light mortars, rifles, supply packs, was laid out in the foreground before being rolled into drops. Churchill was handed a walkie-talkie. It was, apparently, the first time he had used one. He held it the way a man holds something whose mechanics he has not quite decided to trust, and he listened. The transport aircraft ran their approach. The jump commands crackled in his ear, and then, one by one, as each man launched himself through the door, a single word cut through the static. Geronimo. What nobody planned for was the wind. A high wind had come up across the drop zone, and the parachutists were not descending. They were being thrown. Though Churchill would later say the jumps were quite the most remarkable I ever seen. Chutes opened dangerously close to the ground. Men landed hard, skidding across the grass, rolling, coming up disoriented. The wind took them where it wanted, and the men inside the harnesses had no say in the matter. One trooper came down directly in front of the reviewing stand. He hit the ground and lay still, not getting up. Churchill's concern was visible, an expression that costs something in a man practiced at not showing it. For a moment, the trooper simply lay there, stunned, the grass flattened around him. Then he shook his head. He got to his feet. He ran to rejoin his unit. Churchill nodded. The afternoon brought the weapons range and a simulated ground assault. Scout teams, enemy positions, artillery coordinates, and the crack of ordnance in the humid air and the smell of gun smoke drifting across the open ground. The whole visit ran 5.5 hours. By late afternoon, the demonstrations were finished and the reviewing party was moving off the field. Then Churchill turned to Ismay and asked what he thought. Ismay was 55 years old. He had spent his career inside armies. fighting them, administering them, translating the ambitions of politicians into directives that soldiers could execute. He had watched German infantry divisions sweep through France. He knew what veteran troops looked like. He answered without ceremony. To put these troops against German troops would be murder. There is the public letter. There is Ismay's verdict. Both delivered within hours of each other, by men who had watched the same soldiers on the same ground. Churchill could not say what Ismay said. Not to Stimson, not to Marshall, not to Roosevelt, not anywhere that would be read or reported or travel back across the Atlantic. Britain was running on American supply lines, American political will, and the faith that the alliance would hold. Every word Churchill wrote about this visit was written by a man who could not afford to write any other kind of word. The morning after, he wrote to Henry Stimson. He thanked Marshall, he thanked Eichelberger, who had organized the proceedings. He noted his only regret was that time had not allowed a longer stay. And then he wrote, he had never been more impressed than with the bearing of the men whom I saw. He wrote of undemonstrative, therefore grim, hard determination. He wrote that it boded ill for the enemies of the alliance. He did not lie, not exactly. He looked at the soldiers on that parade ground and found the thing he could honestly say: their bearing, their stubbornness, the fact that a man knocked flat in front of a reviewing stand simply got up and ran. And he amplified it, and he set aside the rest. It was the most useful true thing available to him. He used it. Ismay's verdict would be proven accurate within 8 months. In February 1943, at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, American troops met Rommel's veterans for the first time in open battle. The line collapsed. The 1st Armored Division lost most of its tanks and half its artillery. Those units broke and scattered. The German advance covered 50 miles in 48 hours. But everything Ismay had stood on that parade ground and understood about the gap between trained soldiers and combat soldiers was confirmed in the Red Hills of North Africa in 2 days of fighting. But Kasserine was a moment. Ismay had been measuring a moment. Churchill had been looking at something else. By November 1942, American and British forces had landed in North Africa in Operation Torch. The divisions were green and they made mistakes, and they learned from them at a cost that could not be recovered, but they learned. The same system Churchill had watched turning over at Fort Jackson. 9 divisions in training simultaneously, columns cycling through in great and rapid rotation, as Churchill would later describe it. That system kept producing. It had no mechanism for stopping. By 1943, American divisions in North Africa had begun to look like something Rommel's veterans could not simply walk through. By 1944, they were landing on Normandy beaches in the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare. By 1945, they were driving across Germany. Churchill wrote down the carrier numbers because they were the most vivid possible version of what he had witnessed on that South Carolina parade ground. In the autumn of 1942, at the height of the Guadalcanal campaign, the United States Navy had 3 aircraft carriers afloat. A year later, 50. By the end of the war, more than 100. 3 to 100. The industrial logic behind the mass production of divisions was the same logic. It ran on the same tracks. What Churchill had watched at Fort Jackson was not an army. It was the system that produced armies, cycling through its rotations on a red clay parade ground in the Carolina heat, indifferent to the limits of what any single cohort of soldiers could do. Ismay was looking at the soldiers. Churchill was looking at the machine. He would write about it years later, from the safe distance of victory. The American army, he wrote, was a prodigy of organization, of improvisation. He wrote of the small American army of only a few 100,000 men, not long before the war, giving way to the mighty force of millions. He called it a wonder in military history. He wrote specifically of what he had seen that June afternoon, the mass production of divisions, moving through their training in great and rapid rotation. He had written the Stimson letter with a diplomat's calculation, but he wrote the memoir passages with something that sounds very much like genuine awe. Two different documents, two different men writing them in a sense. The man under pressure and the man looking back from safety. But the argument is the same in both. What Churchill chose to praise in June 1942 was not wrong. It was early. He was 67 years old on that parade ground. He had been fighting this war for 2 years by himself. He had pleaded for tools. He had watched Hong Kong fall, Singapore fall, Tobruk fall. He had sat in the Oval Office while the worst news of the North African campaign arrived on a pink slip of paper. He had watched American paratroopers thrown across a South Carolina sky by a wind nobody planned for, and he had watched one of them lie stunned in the grass in front of him and then get up and run. When he turned to Ismay and heard a verdict he could not say aloud. He went to his compartment and wrote a letter to Henry Stimson that said he had never been more impressed in his career. He was not naive. He was not pretending. He was a man who had looked at the same parade ground as his chief of staff and found, somewhere inside the spectacle, something real to hold on to. The bearing, the determination, the stubbornness of a soldier who falls and gets back up. He needed it to be enough. He wrote as though it were. 2 years later, it was.